2 of our lecture for this week on relationality. So the first part of this lecture I've already posted as a video lecture that goes over mostly course administration. So this second half of the lecture for this week, we'll be talking about relationality, and and discussing it as a sort of ontological theory. Okay, let me use this big word. Okay, ontological theory, and its relationship to American Indian thought and philosophy, and also how we can use it as a way of thinking about or reading Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony. Okay, all right. So let's talk about what relationality is. Okay, so last week I introduced the novel Ceremony and the writer Leslie Marmon Silko. So if you like to kind of get that kind of recap in, go back to last week's lecture. I'll put a link to it at the end of this video, also in the description. Okay, all right. And we also talked about the relationship between ceremony as a sort of form of the monomyth, and we talked about the monomyth as what Joseph Campbell calls, and he used a sort of structuralist kind of reading of myths throughout the world, and talks about how they're all kind of the same basic story. But even though you could read Ceremony as being a prototypical monomyth, I'm going to, as well as, like let's say The Matrix or Star Wars, The Matrix, which you need to watch because we're going to talk about in next week's lecture. There's also important specifics about each film and in their particularity in each story and the particularities that I want you to pay attention to. So even though they may all kind of generally fit this kind of structural rubric of the monomyth, even within those differences, there's something very valuable to be found. Okay, so this week then we're going to kind of try to dive in deep and thinking about the way that Ceremony is specifically kind of linked to what might be considered late 20th century modern interpretations of indigenous American Indian thought. All right. So the discussions that the readings that I asked you to go over for this lecture include a work by Ann Waters on American Indian thought. Okay, and also includes a very important essay called Black Elk Speaks, which is basically was the kind of one of the very few kind of recorded collections of I don't know, you want to call it a philosopher, I guess, American Indian philosopher, and his story, and he's part of the Ogallala Sioux tribe. Okay, so I must say, throughout this lecture, I'm just going to try my best to say these names, but I know I'm going to butcher them. So really, I apologize for that. There might be some way to look up the proper pronunciations. I don't know. I recommend that you actually read these works, and you can look up the scholars as well, like Ann Waters, and maybe find lectures that they've done. If you do find anything, please post it in the forums so we can talk about it. Okay. But yeah, Black Elk Speaks is quite famous. It's one of the only works that people really have access to, because there was I think I don't know if he was an anthropologist or someone who went and kind of recorded all these stories and wrote them down. So even then, it's kind of passed down to us in another form, rewritten again. So we can't really be sure, but it's quite similar to the way that people talk about other spiritual texts, religious texts, like like the Bible or the Quran, or the Lotus Sutra. Okay, so we just need to be open-minded about that. Okay, so I recommend that you read through these are required, so you do need to read these things. Okay, and then the reference readings, about the philosophy of native science. Okay, a lot of these come from the same textbook, and this is really, at least I've never had any opportunity to learn about American Indian thought. I did this all kind of on my own, like doing research. So it is quite limited, and I apologize for that. You know, but obviously it's a very rich, kind of a vein of philosophy and thought that you can look into. Maybe some of you end up doing, more research work on it. Okay. But so for our purposes, the way that I'm going to be teaching it is through kind of uh, I guess it is considered Western philosophy, or at least the terminology that I'll be using. So this terminology, like relationality and imminence, these are kind of terms from Western philosophy, but that doesn't mean they don't describe the same kind of perspective or phenomenon. Um, However, like it's important that we understand that I as a scholar and us as students, we can't kind of recreate it, and we can't say that we're really speaking for it, okay, or that we're really speaking for American Indian thought. So I'm just trying to represent it the best I can, based upon the kind of work that I've studied. But at the same time, because it's ontology, and ontology means a theory of what the world or the universe is. Okay, what is the universe? Okay, how does it work? Okay, so that's why originally it's called metaphysics. Okay, so before physics became like the study of particles and movement, there was this question of what is the basic substance of the universe. Okay, and how does it work, and how does it relate to itself, and how do we access it? Okay, so this is all under this kind of rubric of ontology. But that doesn't mean that ontology is distinctly Western. It's just that the word for ontology that we use in academia, at least in Western academia, is Western concepts, okay? But that doesn't mean that the concept that it describes, which is how do you conceive of what the universe is Western, okay? Every religious practice will have some sort of ontology, okay? Like the Bible is, in the beginning there was God, and the the Godhead said, "Let there be light," and so that's the origin of the universe. Okay, so all religious texts have some sort of ontology to them. Okay, so the ontology that I'm describing is one of imminence, and relationality. Now, this is something that several religious practices kind of use, or not use, but ascribe to describing the universe in different ways. Okay, there's going to be very, very strong disagreement about whether or not this is exactly lined up to the way that I'm describing it. So just take all of this with a grain of salt. Okay, but I think it's important to draw it as a sort of distinction, especially with the kind of Judeo-Christian view of things. And this is not to say that everything is exactly lines up, all right? But it's just an attempt, okay, to kind of make sense of it through our concepts and our language. Whether or not you agree with that, that's okay, all right? This is just a way in. That doesn't mean that, okay, to go back to our elephant metaphor, I'm just going to talk about it in the way that I understand, through the lens that I understand and the ones that I've studied. Okay, I could be missing the elephant. I could only be talking about the trunk or the tail. Okay, and I acknowledge that, so I'm just going to try. Okay, just like the monomyth is only one specific way of thinking about it. Okay, and can we ever really grasp the universe? Right? That's okay. All right, so here we go. All right, so the theory that I'm going to put forward to you is one of an imminent universe. So when I use the term imminence, what I mean, and what philosophers mean, and also obviously also people could disagree with this, okay, is that basically there's nothing outside of the universe. Okay, so imminence oftentimes can be contrasted to transcendence. Okay, so transcendence is something that you can think that's kind of easy to understand is, there is the earth, there is the universe that we're bound in, the material universe, you could say, and then there's something outside of that. You could call it heaven, you could call it, you could say hell, you can say there's something that's different, right? Transcendence implies that there's something separate from what we are currently part of and in. Okay, there's an outside. or above. Okay, imminence is thinking that everything is actually all a mode or a modification of the basic substance of reality. So there's nothing more to what is around us. There's nothing less. Okay, and a sort of ontological proof that has been used is by Baruch Spinoza. Okay, and he argues that God and nature are just two words for the same thing, Deus sive natura. Okay, and his argument is that basically instead of thinking of God, right, or and in at least in East Asia, kind of philosophy, you can, in Taoism, for example, you can think of it as like Tian, right? The word for heaven, right? That there's something above, there's something outside, right? That's whole. You could say it's holy or spiritual, right? Or immaterial, and actually that is outside of the universe. Also notions of an independent soul, like that there's a mind-body split. Right, that there's the mind and then there's the body, and the body is the physical, the mind is something that's transcendent, it's outside of the bodily. Okay, imminence is an argument or a theory that actually everything, whether that's the mind or the body, is all part of the same thing. It's all part of the universe. Okay, and the kind of argument that Spinoza makes is that, like, think about the concept of infinity. If something is infinite, that means there can be nothing that's not contained within it. So infinity means everything that can be, and there's no number, right, that's not inside of the infinite. So nothing exists outside of the infinite. So if nothing exists outside of the infinite, right, that means that God is also part of the infinite as well, right? Not transcendent, not outside, but imminent to it. Okay. One really easy way I like to use to think about this is, let's think about like a snow globe. Okay, imagine a snow globe. I don't know if you've ever seen a snow globe. Okay, I'll just snow globe. Okay, all right, snow globe. Right. So let's look at this image of a snow globe. Right. Okay. Let's see if I can make this bigger. So imagine a snow globe. Okay. Bigger. Okay, so here we have a snow globe. Okay, a snow globe is basically, there's like a world, right, and it's inside of a globe, and it's actually all water, right? It's all water inside, and they have these little flakes, right? And if you turn it upside down or whatever, then the flakes will go inside it out, right? So a transcendent view would be like, yes, there's the globe, the snow globe, and whatever is inside of it, that's kind of like what's the world that we can access. And a transcendent view will be that there's something else outside of it. So it's like, you could have like God or a heaven, something else, or spirit that's outside of this globe. And that's transcendent. Now, an imminent perspective would say that everything is the globe. Okay, and there's nothing that's outside of the globe. You can never, there's no escape from the globe. And God, they, him, her, okay, it is the globe itself. God is nature. So there's nothing that's outside of that. And we are all in the globe, we're all part of the globe, and we're all kind of manifestations of the globe. Okay, we're never outside of the globe. Okay, that's an imminent perspective. Okay, so with imminence then, it's an affirmation of reality instead of sort of transcendent ideals or universal definitions. So when you think about imminence then, right, it used like, and this goes back to, we were talking about Plato and we were talking about Aristotle, right, that there's these kind of these universal categories, like a Platonic ideal. Well, a Platonic ideal then would be transcendent, right? It would be something that's outside and that's the perfection, right? And it's the kind of thing that everything gets compared to. But instead, imminence would argue then, actually, there is no perfect outside. Everything is inside. And so there's no sort of model to kind of fix everything to, So there's no absolutes, right? So when, when Nietzsche says that God is dead, he doesn't mean that like someone was, I mean, he might mean this, okay? But at least my kind of figurative interpretation is that he means that this idea that there's some Platonic ideal of a perfection, Godhead, of goodness. There's no such thing as, at least from this transcendent perspective, there might not be such thing as like a perfect goodness, okay, that everything is kind of compared to. Instead, everything is part of the world. Okay, so imminence then would then be, it's like you don't compare something to the object that it should be. You just kind of take it as is. Okay, so then a way to think about it is like the mind. People talk about the mind or the spirit or the soul is really just an expression of the body and therefore still imminent. So your mind is not something that's separate from your body. Your mind would then be part of your body and a phenomenon that's created by your body. So it's a critique of the Cartesian dualism, right, of the mind-body split. Okay, so with Descartes, Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am." Right. So Descartes would argue then that you know that you exist and you can verify because you think, right? But and however, and Ann Waters talks about this. But instead of thinking about because I can conceive of myself, then therefore I am. That's kind of reifying the self. But if you think about it in terms of an imminent kind of ontology, then it would be like we are, therefore I am. So my existence is proof of the existence of the imminent, as opposed to proof of the existence of myself. So Descartes was always kind of worried. It's like, okay, Descartes would think about it like this, okay? And this is still perspectival, okay? Descartes would say, okay, well, I don't know for sure that anything else exists. We're going to watch The Matrix next week, right? But you can't know whether or not you live in the Matrix, okay? I don't know if you're an illusion. We don't know if we're outside of the cave. I don't know if I'm outside of the cave, okay? But I know for sure that I exist and that I'm in the snow globe, okay? Now, a different way of thinking about it would be like, oh, well, no, actually, I know that I exist, or we exist and the world exists, therefore I exist. So the fact that I can sense myself indicates that there is a globe and I'm part of that globe, okay? And that the globe is what makes me exist and I'm part of it, okay? So instead of thinking, am I in the cave, you could say there's no outside of the cave. The cave is it, okay? There's no outside of the cave, okay? We are imminent to it. And now we don't always have access to all of it, and yet we're still part of it, okay? It's a sort of affirmation of reality, okay? A very material kind of view of it, okay? So we are, therefore I am. So it's not just that, it's not just that I exist and only I exist. So like, let's say I'm this little snowman in the snow globe. I can't just say it's like, oh, I know I exist, and but everything else around me might be an illusion. Instead, it's like, well, everything exists, and I'm part of that. And because everything exists, I exist too. And we're all part of this globe. So it's an affirmation of the reality of the cave, and saying that there's no outside of the cave. Okay, but at the same time, acknowledging that there could be everything exists and everything is part of the cave, including the outside of the cave. So another funny way to think about this is everything that we might be considered to be transcendent, including heaven or God or spirituality, is still part of the imminent universe. So I'm going to let that sink in for a little bit. Think about it like this. It's like anything that you think is outside is still inside. And there is no actual outside. Everything is connected. Okay? So that's how we get to, if you have an imminent ontology, right, then that means that everything is relational. So what I mean by relational is that basically everything is connected, okay? When they talk about the monomyth, they say, Joseph Campbell says that, when the hero returns, he discovers and is able to explain to the people that everything is connected, that we are all one, okay? So what he means, a way to conceive of that we are all one, is that we're all in the same snow globe. We're all part of the same snow globe. And God, right, is also the snow globe. And we are all manifestations of that. Okay? Now, whether or not you agree with that, that's not really... When we talk about, philosophy, or we talk about theory, the idea is not to say, like, oh, this is right or this is wrong. The idea is to say, okay, I'm going to understand this perspective or this way of thinking about it. Whether or not the universe is actually... whether or not there's actually transcendence or it's imminent, or that, there's transcendence within the imminent, okay? That's, I welcome you to try to understand that and try to see if you can come up with the truth. But that's something that people have argued and will continue to argue about for a very long time. Okay, so relationality then is based upon what would be considered a process ontology. Okay, so when I say process, I oppose that. I'm thinking that in opposition to substance ontology. Okay, so let's say everything is imminent. Okay, so everything is there's no such thing as something that's outside. Okay, everything is inside. We're all part of it. We're all in the same snow globe. Okay, now that also means that there's nothing that always lasts. There's nothing that ever kind of continues or goes somewhere else. Okay, there's no, and so that means that if you think about it in terms of an imminent form, that means that there's nothing that lasts forever. So everything that exists is in a sort of temporary form. And that temporary form is the product of processes. Okay. So let me think about how to explain this. Okay. So a process ontology is opposed to a substance ontology. So a substance ontology is saying that, there are things. Okay, there's particles, there are objects, and the universe is made up of objects, and the universe itself is an object, right? And that's saying that there are these things like substances. Okay, and if you go back to kind of Greek thought, I guess, classical philosophy, you'll have different people who would say, the universe and everything is composed of this substance, and that substance is air, okay? Or that substance is earth, or that substance is, and then they go for, and then as science, and thinking progresses, they're like, instead of that substance being earth is composed of this substance, which is molecules. And these molecules are made up of these things called particles. And these particles are made up of these things called quarks, and so on and so forth, right? But as you kind of keep going down this line of what is the essential substance, right? Is it atoms, right? And then what are atoms made up of, right? And so on and so forth. You find that actually every kind of definition that you have of a particular substance is kind of defined by a relationship between, a type of relationship, okay? So even something that we consider to be particles really is, a manifestation of energy. And energy is itself a relationship a relationship that then comes to define the objects that it's supposed to be between. Okay. I have a kind of cute little video that I'm going to play for you. Okay. And you can access this in the PowerPoint too. But the idea is that substance is temporary. So whether or not you think of it like, what lasts forever, right? Let's say the earth, okay? The earth is always changing, right? Even the ground beneath our feet, especially in Hong Kong, right? Where, they're adding, they're always adding more dirt to the earth beneath our feet or taking it away, right? That's temporary. The continents are temporary. And even then, the movement of the earth is always shifting through the universe. The universe is always, moving around, okay? And process ontology would then say that instead of kind of trying to build up the universe and understand it and conceptualize it through looking at what things exist, instead you should think about what processes exist, and that the processes themselves are primary. So one example would be to think about like the human body. There's nothing in the human body that lasts forever. Every cell in your body will live and die and decay, and yet you continue. You are still manifest, and we can still conceive of you as existing, even though the things that make you up, the substances that make you up, are not forever, are not continuous, okay? So what is it that makes you still you, even though every part of you has changed, okay? And that is, we would consider that, or I would consider that to be the process of you. You as a biological process of energy going in and energy going out, okay, of movement, of, things growing, changing, and decaying. That process that we call you, your body, okay? And remember, everything in your body has changed and will continue to change throughout your lifetime. every cell will grow and change, right, is the process. And we identify you by memories of manifestations of that process. So in order to understand and identify the world, you would think of the processes. What process can we use to identify that? Okay, and so the process is primary. So this is significant. In one way, you could say it's quite insignificant, right? It's like, oh, what is it that, why is it that this, why does it matter whether we think about everything as a substance as opposed to a process? Well, if process is primary, then the key thing to understanding how things work or why things are is by analyzing the process as opposed to analyzing the substance. Instead of trying to define what something is, you try to understand how the process works. So all things themselves then are constituted by their sorts of relationships. Okay, so let's watch this video. Let's see if we can get the sound too. So it's kind of like a cute video, I guess, but it's like a cartoon. If we can't get the sound, then you should watch it on your own. Loading. While we're waiting for it to load. Basically, it's like if everything is relational, then you want to understand things through their relationship to everything else. So there's very practical ways to think about this. Instead of thinking about, and especially when it comes to cultural studies, instead of thinking about, what is a Chinese person, you can say it's like, well, what are the relationships that constitute Chineseness? And you could say it's like, oh, that's the government, the nation state, and its dictates, it's the geopolitics, it's the cultural practices. So you're always talking about what links something to something else. Okay, so this video is not working. Okay, let's try to open it in another. So it's very helpful for modeling things like identity, for example. I work a lot on thinking about identity in my research. Okay, all right, let's watch it now.
I have been reading of this philosopher named Alfred Whitehead. He says that substances do not exist.
But how can anything exist if not substances? What else could exist?
Process. Everything is process. Only events are real.
But surely there must be something which undergoes process. Are there not substances which endure through time?
No. The appearance of enduring substances is merely the result of our limited point of view. Just as fruit rots and iron rusts, so, too, do stars and even galaxies expire. They have no enduring substance.
But what of atoms? Does not matter itself endure? Is not matter itself made up of atoms which endure through time?
No. Atoms are made up of subatomic particles such as protons, neutrons, and electrons. These in turn are made up of quarks, and so on. Matter itself is made of energy.
But is not energy itself a substance?
No. Energy is a relationship between objects. But since objects themselves are made up of matter, which is made up of energy, which is made up of relationships, we are stuck in a strange loop. The universe is a set of relationships, between relationships, all of which change over time. None of these relationships is ever static.
I see. So you are saying that substance does not undergo process. Rather, process is primary, and what we call substance is merely a temporary pattern produced by that process.
That is correct.
Wow. This changes everything. Thank you for the explanation.
No problem. Sorry about overturning your scientific paradigm.
No worries. Someday I will have my revenge.
Okay, so that's just kind of cute, but that's supposed to be Newton and Einstein. Okay, so Newton was a substance ontologist. He said that things are attracted to each other, right? And instead, Einstein and other kind of process ontologists would argue that actually it's gravity that creates things. Okay, try to let that sink in. It's not things that generate gravity. It's that gravity is what creates things. Okay, the process of gravity. Okay, so then you're trying to understand everything through its relationship to everything else. So nothing is ever by itself. Nothing is ever alone. Okay, everything affects everything. Now, the level of that effect, the degree of that effect, the intensity of that effect, that's something that needs to be understood, okay, and how that effect works. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't affect it in some minute, perhaps inconsequential way. But one real fun metaphor that people used to think about it is this idea, like this kind of story, right? Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas, right? And if you think about it in terms of like, these kind of global events, right? Okay, back to the globe, right? Let's say you decide that instead of driving, you want to walk, right? And you emit a little bit less carbon into the atmosphere. Does that have some effect on the globe that we're in, right? The globe is, the universe is, the Earth is round, right? So, when you emit less carbon into the atmosphere, it does influence how much carbon is in the atmosphere, which then does influence certain things like the climate. Now, the level of that influence, whether we can trace that influence, that's something to be argued. But to say that there's absolutely zero influence is incorrect. To say that there's 0.0000, to say it's 0.0000000001% influence, that's something that needs to be argued about, okay, needs to be studied, okay? But at least if you think about everything as related to each other, right, then every action, right, has a relationship and does something or influences something, okay? So what this would be kind of understood then, from Ann Waters's explanation then, if you think about relationality, if God is nature and nature is God, right, and everything that we do because we are part of nature, influences what else happens within nature, then it changes the kind of understanding of reality. So it's reality not as things, but as a flux, right, as a process, okay? And this flux, I'm using this word flux because, what's his name? Oh my gosh. You can never step in the same river twice. That philosopher. Oh, sorry, it's gonna bother me if I don't remember it. Okay, I don't know what's up with this, but and never step in the same. Okay, it wasn't just Pocahontas who said that. Heraclitus, yes, Heraclitus, the philosopher of flux. Okay, so the Heraclitean ideal is that everything is just flux, and it's always kind of forces, you could say processes, right, moving against each other. That creates what we consider to be substances, right? And substances are just events, okay? They're temporary. So then, native science, according to Ann Waters then, views nature as a dynamic, ever-flowing river of creation, inseparable from our own perceptions, the creative center from which we and everything else we have come and to which we always return. Chaos is both movement and evolution, the process through which everything in the universe becomes manifest and then returns. Flux is the evolving universe in self-creation. Okay, so let's look at the snow globe. Right, I don't know. Keep going back to the snow globe, right? So it's much easier to think about if we think about everything as always enmeshed or embedded, or you could say inside of, right, or part of. So like in a snow globe, it's very easy to visualize, right, because everything is water. So if I shake this part, let's say I'm the snowman, right, and I move my arm, it's going to affect the snow, capsules or flakes here, okay? Now, if we expand the idea of the globe, then everything is related. Every time I move, something else within the universe moves too, because we're all part of that flux. We're all inside a sort of, river or flowing water, if you want, okay? So flux is the evolving universe in self-creation. So you imagine that this is constantly moving, okay? It's constantly changing. But you know what looks like that? Our actual globe, our actual Earth, right? It is always moving. Wind is always moving. Earth is always moving. Change, there's constant change going on. Everything is temporary, okay? That's the kind of flux, all right, that they meet, okay? So then, if reality is flux, if nature itself is always changing, always moving, right? And there's nothing sort of outside of that, right? Then is there an ethical system to that, okay? So I've given you pages where you can look at the way that you can close read and analyze it, okay? I'm already kind of used up a lot of time in this lecture, so I think maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave possibilities for close reading to you. But on ceremony page 114 to 117, it kind of describes this kind of idea of reality as a flux, okay? Then it also leads to, now, after ontology then, right, let's say you do have a sort of understanding of what the universe is, then what is your place in it? What is your ethics, right? So the Burkhart reading then has one called What Coyote and Thales Can Teach Us, okay? And the ethical system would then be this, is that everything that you do, everything that anyone does, has effect on the universe because everything is related. It could be minor, it could be major, okay? You know, that's up for discussion, okay? So that means that what you do has influence and impact, okay? So Burkhart uses the story of Coyote, Prairie Dogs, and the Rain, okay? And in this story, we're supposed to learn from Coyote's mistake, which is not letting what is right, the right way to act regarding his relatives, the prairie dogs, and so forth, guide his actions, but rather acting solely on the basis of his own wants and desires. We are supposed to also see from this story that we must be careful what we do, what we want, and what we think and speak in general. We must never forget the things around us and how we are related to those things. So as an ethical system, if you think about something, it has effect on the universe, right? Because your thoughts are not indifferent. They're not separate from the materiality of your body, the materiality of the universe. Okay, it's quite fascinating to think that even the things that you say, the things that you think, the things that you want, that you believe, have influence on the world. Okay, that's the level of relationality that we're talking about. It doesn't stop at your body. Okay, it doesn't stop at your mind. And there's some discussion of this in ceremony, specifically like talking about like the rain, for example, right? So remember, we talked, I talked about this last week, right? But this is that fundamental level of relationality that we're talking about, right? It's, when Teo says, that he prayed away the rain when he was in the Pacific Theater fighting in the war. If you take a real strict view of relationality, his prayer that there no longer be rain influences whether or not there is rain in other places in the world, including back home on the reservation. So that's the level of the ethical system, okay? But at the same time, you might say like, oh, that means that, wow, you have influence, so you shouldn't do, negative things like pray against the rain. But the converse is not the converse. Is the inverse? I don't know, whatever. The other side of that is also true. That means that when you pray for rain, it actually has influence on the universe. When you conduct a ceremony, it actually influences, whether or not your community survives. That means that the actions that you have consequence, positive or negative. Okay, so not only does that mean that when you do something like, do something that's bad, like kill someone or hurt yourself, that also hurts others, right? Also, when you do good things, it also helps others, okay? So this is the principle of relatedness, okay? The idea here is simply that the most important things to keep in mind are the simple things that are directly around us in our experience and the things to which we are most directly related. How we act imparts the way the world is, the way in which a question will get answered, the way in which we ask questions, the way in which we act toward our relations guides us, then, to the right answers rather than the other way around, wherein what is true directs the method of questioning and the question itself. Okay? So, according to this principle of relatedness, okay, it's not just what is the truth, it's how do you get to the truth. And how do you ask for what the truth is, guides, right, and directs the way that that question will get answered and what the truth kind of is, okay? So then it leads to an ethical duty to the world. How we act is not merely a result of causal interactions with the world. How we act is not merely a response to stimuli. The world is not empty and meaningless, bearing only truth and cold facts. We participate in the meaning-making of the world. There is no world, no truth, without meaning and value, and meaning and value arise in the intersection between us and all that is around us. So if there's no transcendence, then everything in the universe is connected to us, right? We're all part of that same globe, right? Then that means that your activities, your influences your relationship with that world. So how we behave then, in a certain sense, shapes meaning, gives shape to the world. In this way, what we do, how we act, is as important as any truth and fact. We can think of this as the meaning-shaping principle of action. We are embedded in the world. Our movement affects the movement of everything else. So what is true is what is right. Okay? So then, that's another thing that's important to understand is the quest is not for knowing what is, right? So it's not a question of, are we inside or outside? Are we in the cave or are we outside of the cave? Is this elephant actually the elephant? Okay, it's more how. How do you know that? How do you know? How do you come to find? So Maxine Waters says, for Indians, American Indians, the story conveys knowledge. Knowledge does not convey the story. The story is primary. The story is the process. The knowledge that comes out of it is the result. It's the event. So the knowing is in the performance of or ceremony. It is in the living or life of the ceremony. Indian knowing is not propositional knowledge that can be had about the ceremony. Okay, so then storying, right, is a process. So vision is active and impermanent, never caught in a single moment of still perception. The human mind is an active, metaphoric mind that describes, imagines, and creates from an animate world. In storytelling, we story, that is to say, engage with the world. And in native science, we story, that is, engage with nature. So storying nature requires participation in the oldest mind, the metaphoric mind, in song, dance, ceremony, and technology. So I do want to close read one passage, okay? And this is the opening lines of ceremony, okay? And again, if I screw up this pronunciation, I'm really sorry, okay? All right. So the opening lines of the novel is Titsinako, thought woman, is sitting in her room, and whatever she thinks about appears. She thought of her sisters, and together they created the universe, this world, and the 4 worlds below. Thought woman, the spider, named things, and as she named them, they appeared. She's sitting in her room thinking of a story now. Okay, so that's a sort of first level of the story. The first level is a story of someone coming up with a story, and that story becomes or is the universe. So she's sitting in her room thinking of a story now, and I'm telling you the story she's thinking. Ceremony. So this novel and the universe is the ceremony that's being created. So ceremony. I will tell you something about stories, he said. They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They are all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness and death. If you think about the world of a novel, it's the same way. Every time someone gets named, it gets created in your imagination of that novel, of the setting, of the characters. So everything gets created by the story. So there was no setting that preexists the story. There's no characters that preexist the story. Okay? It's the story that creates the characters, that creates the life, that creates the setting. Now, the ontological view then would be to expand that, to say to tell a story of the world is to create the world. Okay? So you don't have anything if you don't have the stories. And so the story, the process of telling story, of visioning the world, of making the world, of what they're saying storying, is what makes the world. So that means that the story that you tell about the world, your interpretation of the world, your connection and your relationship to the world, is incredibly significant because that's the making of the world. So you don't have anything if you don't have the stories. Their evil is mighty, but it can't stand up to our stories. So they try to destroy the stories, let the stories be confused or forgotten. They would like that. They would be happy because we would be defenseless then. He rubbed his belly. I keep them here, he said. Here, put your hand on it. See? It is moving. There is life here for the people. And in the belly of this story, the rituals and the ceremony are still growing. What she said. The only cure I know is a good ceremony. That's what she said. He rubbed his belly. I keep them here, he said. Oh, I already said this, okay? And then sunrise. So then the story that we're reading, then begins as well. Okay? All right. So remember, vision is active and impermanent. Okay? All right. So then what is the function of the ceremony? Okay? How do we interpret Teo bringing back the rain? Is this just superstition? Right? Or is he literally bringing back the rain by enacting the ceremony? and enacting himself. Okay, and what are the function of the stories and the dreams? Do they describe reality? Are they different ways to understand their function? And what do we lose if we see them as metaphorical instead of literal? And I think this is a really important question. A lot of people will talk about like religion, okay, as metaphor. What if you say it's like, oh, it's just an allegory. It's not, it's not what actually happened. It is, a story, a way of imagining it in order to understand it as a metaphor, as a sort of story about how to, be ethical, how to understand your place in the universe. It's a metaphor, right? But what if you use this kind of, American Indian thought way of conceiving it, is instead of thinking about, no, it's not a metaphor, it's literal. And the literal act of telling the story is what makes the world. How does that change interpretation? And how does that give real force to the actual story of ceremony itself and its significance? For both this character, Teo, but also the kind of story of indigenous life and the story of, genocide, right? Because like the fact is that, the 99% of indigenous people were wiped out. The fact is that their land was taken. The fact is that, they live on reservations in poverty, right? So what is it about a story that can change that? And I think that this is a really important thing to think about in terms of our course as well, the art and politics of narrative. What is the power of narrative? Why does it matter? Is economics the only thing that matters? Do we have zero influence on the universe, on the world? Right? What's the function of culture even if everything is based upon what the government says or what the laws that are out there or what people with money do, okay, or the economic system? Does the story actually matter? Okay, and ceremony is supposed to be, well, I don't know about supposed to be, but ceremony is a story about the importance of the ceremony, the importance of it in bringing back the rain, of finding the cattle. Okay. And that's the cattle is a sort of a material link to the world, and saying like, oh, the cattle is the actual thing that Teo needs to do. He needs to physically survive. He needs to physically find the cattle. But I think one thing that's important to think about is if Teo did not believe in the story, if he did not believe in the ceremony, would he actually find the cattle? Would he actually be able to survive? Would he actually be able to overcome alcoholism and addiction? Okay, these are important questions, and would there actually be hope for the future of this indigenous tribe? Okay, all right. So I want you to think about all that within the context of ceremony as you're finishing it. Okay, I would like for you to, if you can, get together and talk about the novel with some classmates, whether that's through Skype or something like that. That's great, and you could record it, or at least share with us what you discussed. You can also post about it in the forums. Okay. So the next part of this I want to talk about is a reference reading I gave to you by a speech. Okay, by Russell Means. Okay, so Russell Means is a activist. You could say from our Western perspective, you could say he's a scholar, a teacher, an intellectual, and an activist. For the American Indian movement, and he gave a speech, okay, and he didn't write it down, but it was transcribed, okay. He doesn't write anything down, right? Because it's for him and for many, I think writing is also a form of Western Eurocentric kind of imperialism, okay. But this was transcribed with his permission, and so it's a record that we have, okay. And his speech is titled "For America," and I think it's American Indians. Let's look at it. Okay, in Moodle. Okay, in the reference reading. Oh, where did I put it? Okay. All right. I'll repost it in Moodle. Okay. For America to live. Okay. I'll post this. Okay. But you can always just Google it as well. Okay. And it's a speech he gave in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Right. And in this speech, he says, the writing process itself epitomizes the European concept of legitimate thinking. What is written has an importance that is denied the spoken. It is one of the white world's ways of destroying the cultures of non-European peoples, the imposing of an abstraction over the spoken relationship of a people. Okay, so writing is, in the Eurocentric kind of colonizer model, is given more power. Okay, but this is itself a European concept. Okay, that is used to delegitimize, the practices, and ways of communication of non-European peoples. Okay. So when he uses this term European, then he's saying that doesn't mean it as a racial thing. He doesn't mean it as a skin color or a particular genetic structure. What he's referring to is a mindset, a worldview that is a product of the development of European culture. So he's saying people are not genetically encoded to hold this outlook. They're acculturated to it. The same is true for American Indians or for the members of any culture. So according to him, then, this term European, he also means me, right? Like someone like me. I'm a Western academic scholar. My ways of thinking have been acculturated, and developed through immersion in the kind of Western academic system. Okay, so he's saying that this kind of worldview is the thing that he's opposed to. Okay, so he says this guy's obviously very smart and studied a lot. Okay, he argues that the European worldview is one that emphasizes gaining. Okay, materialist acquisition versus being. Okay, and he says that being is a spiritual proposition, and gaining is a material act. Traditionally, American Indians have always attempted to be the best people they could. Part of that spiritual process was and is to give away wealth, to discard wealth in order not to gain. Material gain is an indicator of false status amongst traditional people, while it is proof that the system works to Europeans. Clearly, there are two completely opposing views at issue here, and Marxism is very far to the other side from the American Indian view. So this is really important. So for Russell Means, then, Marxism and capitalism, okay, or socialism and capitalism, okay, right, are both Eurocentric, are both European. Okay, they're both opposed to an American Indian viewpoint. At least Russell Means' representation of that. Okay, because both Marxism and capitalism are mainly thinking about the ability of are mainly concerned with the division of material gains. Right, and this is the idea that you can own. That ownership is something that's worthwhile. Right, so who owns the means of production? Right, Marxism says it should be the laborers. Right, capitalism says it should be, the acquisition of capital and the kind of the acquisition and the use of capital in order to, gain more materiality. Okay, and material power. Okay, but both of these are opposed to the American Indian view. Right, so he's saying that he's not aligned with Marxism. Okay, whereas Marxism was aligned with a lot of people's decolonization movements. Okay, but Russell Means is saying a non-alignment with Marxism because revolutionary Marxism is committed to even further perpetuation and perfection of the very industrial process which is destroying us all. Okay, so this is about industrial modernity. Okay, it offers only to redistribute the results, the money maybe, of this industrialization to a wider section of the population. It offers to take wealth from the capitalists and pass it around. But in order to do so, Marxism must maintain the industrial system. Okay, so in this sense, then, the problem is European modernity. European modernity as a sort of system of production and industrialization is something that even Marxism is a part of. Okay, so they're still part of the same coin. So who is this revolution for? Okay, so once again, the power relations within European society will have to be altered, but once again, the effects upon American Indian peoples here and non-Europeans elsewhere will remain the same. This is much the same as when power was redistributed from the church to private business during the so-called bourgeois revolution. European society changed a bit, at least superficially, but its conduct toward non-Europeans continued as before. You can see what the American Revolution of 1776 did for the American Indians. It's the same old song. So a Marxist revolution is not necessarily aligned with American Indian survival, okay, or its continuance, its preservation, right? So for him, then, Marxism is a European modernity. All right. So revolutionary Marxism, like industrial society and other forms, seeks to rationalize all people in relation to industry, maximum production. It is a doctrine that despises the American Indian spiritual tradition, our cultures, our lifeways. Okay. So something you can look at. You can close read Ceremony, page 122 to 128. So he continues and he says, I do not believe that capitalism itself is really responsible for the situation in which American Indians have been declared a national sacrifice. No, it is the European tradition. European culture itself is responsible. Marxism is just the latest continuation of this tradition, not a solution to it. To ally with Marxism is to ally with the very same forces that declare us an acceptable cost. So ultimately then, he's conducting a critique of Western rationality, okay? That everything needs to be countable, okay? And counting in a sort of material way. You can say it's like, what is the substance? The substance is, the number of things that you have and counting that. And that is what the Western rational system is based on. So Russell Means argues that distilled to its basic terms, European faith, including the new faith in science, equals a belief that man is God. Europe has always sought a Messiah, whether that be the man Jesus Christ, or the man Karl Marx, or the man Albert Einstein. American Indians know this to be totally absurd. Humans are the weakest of all creatures, so weak that other creatures are willing to give up their flesh that we may live. Humans are able to survive only through the exercise of rationality, since they lack the abilities of other creatures to gain food through the use of fang and claw. But rationality is a curse, since it can cause humans to forget the natural order of things in ways other creatures do not. A wolf never forgets his or her place in the natural order. American Indians can. Europeans almost always do. We pray our thanks to the deer, our relations, for allowing us their flesh to eat. Europeans simply take the flesh for granted and consider the deer inferior. After all, Europeans consider themselves godlike in their rationalism and science. God is the supreme being, all else must be inferior. So, if you think of God as a supreme and transcendent being that's separate from the universe, right? Then, and you compare yourself and say that, God made man in his image, then you are superior to everything else because you are also part of that transcendent. Your soul is with God, right? And God is outside. But let's say God is the universe. That means that when you eat, a deer, right, animal flesh or something like that, you're also eating God because God is part of that nature. So Russell Means is saying that you have to thank the deer. You have to say thank you to that relation because that relation enables my existence. I'm not outside of it. I'm inside of it. I'm part of that. I'm embedded in it. And being able to eat that so that I can exist is not saying that the deer is inferior. The deer and I are the same. We're all part of that globe. We're all part of that snow globe. Okay? We're all related to each other. All right? So that's the kind of critique, right? Now, this idea of Western rationality is part of what, at least in ceremony, they're calling witchery. Witchery is basically, at least my reading of it, right, is that witchery is this idea of Western rationality, of thinking about things in terms of this Western rational system of substance and counting, right, and difference, right? Witchery is a belief that we are separable, and that for example, right, when Teo kills a Japanese soldier, that he's killing someone who is not on his side, who is separate from him, right? Whereas if you take a kind of belief that everything is connected and everyone is related, then killing someone is killing someone, and killing someone is like killing your own people because everything is the same. Everything is part of the same system. Okay, there's no differences between. Okay, there's no inferior or exterior. So witchery is a belief in the fundamental difference between things, that there's a transcendent difference. Okay. And Western rationality is built upon that. Western modernity is built upon categorization. You create categories, and then you look at the differences between those categories, and then you mine those differences, you collect those differences, and you kind of create these differentials between, have and have not, more and less, and those differences then allow you to gain. You create gain from that, right? So, a very simple explanation of capitalism would be like, okay, this thing costs X amount to make. If I can make it for less, then the less money, less manpower, less materials, then I will profit, and that profit I can then use to invest and create more systems that will enable me to profit more and more and more. This is a form of Western rationality, right? And this is what the ceremony is calling witchery. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. okay? But this differentiation, okay, this way of thinking about this way of thinking about ontology, right? You know, that everything is related, leads to a very different set of ethical systems, okay? Right? If everything can be broken down into substances like particles, right? That means that things are inherently separate, okay? But if everything is inherently relational, that means that there is always a sort of ethical kind of relationship between one and the other, right? So it's very not libertarian, okay? I'll put it like that, okay? And so that's a sort of, and that's why doing something like a ceremony would make a difference. That's why the story that you believe will make a difference. That's why the type of, you know, and how stories teach how things happen make a difference. And this is a way of conceiving how the flap of a butterfly's wings could, in Brazil, could set off a tornado in Texas. Okay? All right, so that's it for this lecture. Please talk more in the forums about whether that's relationality, you know, and just remember, it's like this is my attempt. This does not mean that it's true. Okay, this doesn't mean it's fact. Okay, there's a lot more readings to be done, a lot more understanding, and a lot that's also been lost to us that we don't have access to. Okay, you know, anyway, you know, I tried my best to kind of explain this. So, but I know that you'll have lots of questions. Okay, so go ahead and post those in the forums, and I'll try to give you feedback. And you know, if you have more insight, you know, and you think but you do have access to resources or ways of understanding this, please do share with the class. Okay, so I look forward to hearing what you have to say about ceremony, about relationality, about yeah. So that's it for this week. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.